Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
And an early happy Gregorian New Year. It's, I know, a little bit clumsier to say it that way, but it keeps it clear. So, as you can tell, I'm still getting over my sniffle, which leads me to the most important theological question: why do people get sick? I mean, yes, we can answer that from a medicinal point of view. We can talk about viruses and bacteria and all of the different vectors and those kinds of things. And thankfully, we do have researchers and doctors who do have those discussions. I'm not exactly qualified, however, to lead such a discussion. But I think it is important to ask an underlying question, which is, why is it possible at all? Why does God have a world where sickness is a possibility? Realizing, of course, that at the beginning of time, when God began the creation, presumably God had an infinite palette to work from. God had the complete set of Legos, if you will, for reality, and could compile them in any way, shape, or form as God was moved to do so. Why compile them in a way that allows sickness to be possible? Well, there is one answer that is given historically. Back in the time of Roman occupation, our sages were often confronted by Romans who wished to show them up for being backward provincials. After all, they were mighty Rome, and they had the wisdom of the ages that they had stolen from the places they had conquered. Who were we off in the eastern Mediterranean backwaters to think that we understood reality? And when the sages were asked, not about sickness, but about poverty, it was a very pointed question. The sages said, the Roman attacker said to the sages, why is it that you help the poor? Because after all, doesn't the fact that somebody is poor show that God wants them to be poor? If you are helping them, you are subverting God's justice. I think, for example, if the emperor had thrown somebody into prison, if you were to go and take them out of prison, the emperor would be very mad with you. Likewise, if somebody is suffering, clearly God wants them to suffer, and you should not lift a finger to do anything about it. Now, this reveals a number of things. One, that the Romans were jerks, but that wasn't really much of a secret up to this point. Two, that the Romans had already noticed that there was this propensity for charity, for tzedakah, for compassion within the Jewish people, that we already had a reputation of wanting to help other people, such that it could be used as an attack against us, as though we were being inconsistent in our understanding of God. But the sages had a ready response. It was a response suitable for the Roman. The response was quite simple, that God allows people to be sick, allows them to be poor, in order that we, the rest of the community, might earn merit by helping them. After all, if a person was never out of sorts, if they were never suffering, never poor, never sick, then how would a person ever be able to use the capacity for compassion? When would we be merciful if no one was ever in need of mercy? By God allowing this to take place, it is an invitation to us to act on a higher level than would be possible were they to always be in perfect condition. Now, that seemed to satisfy the Roman, but our tradition has continued to wrestle over this, because if you think about it another step, it is still slightly unsatisfying. That is to say, if you think about it more deeply than a Roman would. Because while it is great that we have the capacity to earn the merit by being merciful, that we have the capacity to learn empathy and sympathy and learn how to be compassionate, is it really worth the price that others have the capacity to suffer, that we have the capacity to suffer, and far worse than just a sniffle? Is the capacity for compassion really equal to the capacity for pain in the world? Or is this something that maybe is too high a price to pay? And so I will offer a slightly more nuanced and unfortunately painful explanation, which is that our capacity to suffer is built into the fabric of the universe itself. It is not an option. Going back to that metaphor I said, with God having all of the Legos with which to work to build a universe, yes, they were building blocks. That is to say, the universe was going to be, in God's mind, a place, a thing made up of other things that would interact with things. Some of those would have souls that we call humans, but a human we are is still a collection of things. The various atoms, molecules, and more complicated structures within you, we are stuff. And in order to be stuff, you have to be able to break. That is a component of being stuff. If you were not stuff, you would be perfect, and if you were perfect, you would not be stuff. But you say, then maybe God should have made me perfect. Why did God bother to make me out of stuff if stuff is simply that which can break down? Well, because that breaking down is precisely needed. Because through the capacity for suffering, through the capacity for breaking, through the capacity for pain, what we are actually seeing is the bigger topic, the capacity to change. That which is perfect is timeless and immutable. And God could make angels aplenty. That would be timeless and immutable. That would not change, and that would be perfect. But that isn't the world that God wanted to create. God wanted a world where people would strive, where people would grow a soul through choice, through free will. But in order for that to work, we had to be able to change. We had to be able to be more than we were yesterday, tomorrow, or be worse than we were yesterday when it comes time for tomorrow. By being physical, we have the capacity to become anything. But unfortunately, that means we can become sick. It means we can become hurt. It means we can become all of the various types of suffering in the world. But it means we also can become full of love. It means we can become wiser. It means we can become more compassionate. And it means that we have the capacity to tackle the problems of illness, of poverty, of all the many varieties of suffering. Because something that is breakable is also something that is fixable. Something that is breakable is also something that can be protected. Yes, not permanently, not forever. There is, as David says very poignantly in this week's Haftarah, the way of all the earth. We will all eventually expire. But by being changeable and susceptible to problems, we also are changeable and capable of overcoming them. And this is the path that God has given us. And it is a path that is built into the very existence. So while we can lament that illness or other forms of suffering exist, especially with head colds and worse conditions, we must recognize that that is part of the reality that we live in. And it is that same reality that gives us the capacity for everything that fills us with joy, everything that fills us with hope, and everything that allows us to walk in a path that God has tried to show us. Shabbat Shalom.